Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic, the podcast that breaks down the incentive structures in our society to understand who benefits from the status quo and what's at stake for the future. I'm Matt Haller.
And I'm Chris Michaud.
How's your week, Chris?
So far, so good. Getting ready to spend some tip money in Vegas this weekend. But I don't know if you saw, there was an article that came out from CNBC about half of young adults suffering from money dysmorphia. Have you heard of this?
I'm familiar with many dysmorphias as a child of the 2000s, but money dysmorphia is a new one. What does that even mean?
Well, being a child of 2000s, it'll fit right in with you. So basically, the so what of the article was that social media has put a new spin on keeping up with the Joneses. So that old concept of having to outspend your neighbor and all that.
So it's saying that, like, even though you have some money put away, maybe you have a house, the standard that people are trying to hold themselves to is I've got to have my private jet, my house in the Hamptons, and be able to go to vacation in Monaco.
Maybe it's a little less of that. Maybe it's I have to have my boat on the weekends, my second home. But yeah, you're on the right track. So even people who would be considered well off by statistical means are still feeling like they're living hand to mouth, which is interesting.
Chris, I think that's a really good transition into what our topic is going to be for this week. So on this week's show, we're going to be diving into the incentives around housing and real estate development and looking into why housing isn't getting less expensive despite affordable real estate being an issue for decades. But first, let's jump into the history behind it all.
So Matt, bear with me. We're going to fire up the Wayback Machine here. So basically, the modern housing market, how all of us know it today, pretty much before the Second World War, didn't exist. Prior to that point, really Americans were the home of the free and the land of the renter. Home ownership as a percentage was barely a little bit over 40%. And the mortgage market back then, because you didn't have credit scores and things like that, was quite draconian. So you would basically have to come up with almost 50% down and you would have a 5 to 10 year loan term. There were a few exceptions to this. If you've had any elderly relatives strap you in a chair and force you to watch at Christmas time, It's a Wonderful Life, you might have remembered the Bailey Brothers Building and Loan. So there were some things that were like local building societies where residents would pool money together, loan it to each other to build houses. During the Depression, government did take in some ways with the FHA, so the Federal Housing Administration, and there was a homeowners loan corporation. But basically, those things were designed for folks who already had a home. So they wanted to make sure they didn't lose it because foreclosure rates were already pretty high. The war changed all that. So during the 40s, we came up with the GI Bill. So as a returning serviceman, have an opportunity to buy a house with basically no money down. And then mortgage terms were also extended. The 30-year mortgage was born out of this act. Keep in mind, America had gone basically 15 years with nothing but global and economic misery. And we were the only ones coming out of it with any manufacturing. So there was this insatiable demand for both consumer goods and, more importantly, a place to actually live. The government knew they had to solve that problem sooner rather than later. We also traded one ism for another. So we spent 4 years fighting fascism, and then we traded it for communism. The government believed that if a man owned his own house, he would be less likely to be a communist. So really getting into the mortgage business for the government was able to help them both fight a housing problem, but also fight the Cold War at the same time. And the impact of that was extraordinary. By 1960, home ownership jumped to something like 60%. And in fact, it hovered around then ever since. The modern suburb was born. We built highways to get to and from the office. You get the idea of the word mall. It really transformed how we live and how we are. And part of that too was tackling home building, because supply was like an assembly line. It was a man by the name of William Levitt, who became one of the richest men by designing homes like an assembly line. There were 27 steps. Each one was done the same. And to put it in perspective, if you bought a house back in the old days, if a builder built 4 houses a year, that would have been a big deal. This guy was putting them up every 15 to 20 minutes. So it was mind-boggling even today. And that helped keep prices down. Ever since then, things have been kind of up and down. New zoning regulations and land use policies have really exacerbated shortages because I can't build where I used to be able to build, especially in high demand areas. And then really the biggest crisis of all was 2008. And the construction business basically dried up and new homes weren't built at scale for close to a decade. So what's happened now is 90 million millennials, so to your point around your 2000s generation, have come along and all want to buy houses. So the guest today actually will shed some light on those issues and how we can resolve them.
Do you think it's fair to say that 50, 60, 70 years ago, building housing was like a very important pillar of something that the government did because there was more land available? But over the course of the last 30 years, there's been this push towards privatization, whether it's on privatization of the developers, privatization of the mortgage industry, and then all of a sudden, the incentive structures on what's important in housing go from the actual house itself to potential of this asset class.
Yeah, it goes both sides, right? So prior to the housing crisis, as you brought up, the whole concept of the kind of securitization of mortgages, The idea was no one would ever default on their mortgage. Who would not pay their mortgage? It was such a foreign concept that the risk wasn't anywhere near zero. So that's why these consumers actually started treating it the same way as investors did. So they looked and said, instead of me suffering to pay this mortgage, which was the kind of home is where the heart is, they said, this place is worth half of what I paid for it. So why on earth would I make any more mortgage payments? And people just walked away from their houses. I mean, you had entire half-built neighborhoods that people just walked away. So I think to your point around how that's come together, the incentive of housing is more of a wealth creation versus a pure place to live or fixed rent, as some people used to think about it.
Thanks for sharing all that, Chris. I think there's a lot for us to talk about, both with housing being a vehicle for wealth creation, but also remembering that it's a place where people live and it's a place where there's emotions and there's memories tied up in it. And as that dream slips away from people, there's going to be a lot of emotion tied up in that as well. So I'm looking forward to exploring that.
We'll be right back with our first guest, Kelly Gisburne, a real estate pro with over 3 decades of experience. Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic. Our first guest is Kelly Gisburne, a Chicago-based star realtor and broker with nearly 30 years of experience. Welcome, Kelly.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Before we get into anything, tell us about yourself and what your secret has been in surviving such a rough and tumble industry all these years.
Well, I first started in real estate as just a little receptionist at the front of the office almost 30 years ago. I was making a very tiny amount of money after school, but it's amazing what you can do while you're in that position to learn from the good and the bad that's going on in the industry. And then I continued on to a 4-year university and kept that job and did bookkeeping for them, office management, you name it, I did it until I could finally get licensed. I ended up going on and being a licensed realtor and have kept doing that. Probably what's kept me here is my brutal honesty. I know that sometimes gets me in a little bit of trouble, as not everybody likes to hear me tell them what they don't want to hear. But it's what the clients that appreciate me for that are the ones that have kept me going.
Well, Kelly, I'm wondering if you can contextualize this moment in the housing industry for us, because I feel like every 4 years we start talking about the housing industry and what's happening with housing. And as a millennial, I feel like that message has been just jammed down our throats as a generation for the last 15 years. So can you tell us a little bit about what's happening with the housing industry today? Where are there constraints and pressures, and where are there really incentives for people to do something or not?
Yeah, it's funny. The market right now, it's weird. And please, everybody remember that real estate is very local. But the bottom line is the market is tight with inventory. And this is causing a problem for people to buy because either they can't find what they want because there's just a shortage. It doesn't help that the interest rates are higher, than anything probably your generation has seen, of course. And buyers, they're also willing to bounce and move around a little bit more too. So they might opt for the rental route if that's what makes more sense for them. Although I will say most people aren't staying in their homes as long as they used to before. So there's a lot of movement, but also not enough inventory, strangely enough.
Do you think that's the ghost of 2008 still haunting us? For those of us that remember that, right? Housing came to a stop for 10 years. We didn't build anything. Is that causing part of the problem?
That is definitely causing part of the problem. I mean, we've had a lot of other things happen in between as well that have caused problems with interest rates and just with how people find their properties and find their homes. But the shortage of property from builders, that's a big deal. It didn't seem like it was going to be a big deal to most of us back then. But when buyers couldn't get loans to buy properties after the 2008 crisis, neither could the builders. And I think that's a lot of what the public doesn't understand. They didn't have the financing available to them either to go and build these homes. And they were probably, some of them were convinced no one was going to buy that because the market did come to a rather screeching halt altogether. So it's a shame because it's going to take a long time, I think, for us to catch up. And I don't honestly know if they can ever totally catch up, but it's part of what's causing, in my opinion, the seller's market that we've mostly been in most markets around the country.
So Kelly, I was listening to the New York Times podcast, and there was an episode called "It Sucks to Be 33." And it was talking about how within the millennial cohort, this group of people is the largest cohort within that generation. And there was a phrase that stuck with me that it's almost like this generation is trying to squeeze into an economy that's like a sweater that's like a size too small. So it's almost like when we look at housing, it feels as though 2008
we shrunk the size of the market, and then all of a sudden this massive group of people was trying to come behind it to buy homes that simply weren't there. And it sounds like two trends that you've noticing. The first one is prices are going up, so the idea of buying a house is further out of reach, but then there's also more mobility that might make the prospect of somebody actually wanting to make that investment less attractive in the first place.
Yes, they are a generation that doesn't have a lot of inventory available to them because our generation and the older generation, they are seemingly keeping a lot of their homes, especially if they've refinanced into any sort of nice interest rate, like really low interest rate. That's actually stopping a lot of people from moving. Why would they move if they don't have to and they don't want to? And their alternative might be to rehab their home. And certain generations are more willing to rehab their home. They might have more the finances for that or just the stomach for it.
Do you think sellers, because of the inventory you mentioned, have had kind of the upper hand for the last couple years? Do you think that's going to continue to trend in the future, or do you see that being somewhat less important?
It really does depend on the market. Already we're seeing in some markets where some of the pricing has cooled. Maybe the sellers have gotten a little too greedy and they're pricing their houses so incredibly high, but it depends where they started too. Are we talking new construction resales from 20 years ago, or are we talking stuff that was built like mid-century modern? And then are we talking single family or condominium townhouses, attached type properties? There is a difference and it depends where you're at. But unfortunately, with the shortage of property, or again, maybe with the shortage of the correct type of property, I do foresee this going on probably another 5 years, which doesn't sound thrilling to the buyers of the world. It's great for the sellers, not so great for the buyers.
We talk a lot about affordable housing and how we bring the cost of building down. If you were to wave a magic wand, what are the 2 or 3 things that we need to do better as a country to make sure that we've got a better affordable supply of housing?
So if I could really wave a magic wand, what I would do is make this all more balanced so that buyers, and I'm going to say this and my sellers won't be very happy, but my buyers, which I have a lot more of right now than sellers, by the way, make this so much easier for them. It's not pleasant right now when you're having to go to a property, make a decision so quickly, and then write an offer where you're in a multiple offer situation. Buyers are not having a fun time right now. I don't know that I have all the answers. I definitely do not. But I do think a lot of it has to do with the lending and also how sellers and the world or the country perceives what type of lending people get.
Since you talked about buyers, a great way to sort of wrap this in line with our incentives around fuzzy logic is you probably heard recently, right? The NAR finally settled in terms of the whole debate around realtor commissions and stuff. And since you obviously work with a lot of buyers, do you think that's going to be a detriment to buyers in the future in terms of having representation like yourself if sellers have suddenly said, look, I don't want to pay that type of commission anymore?
Yes, this is truly shaking up our industry. And not that our industry doesn't need some sort of a shakeup. And I'm all for more transparency to the public because I think our industry is very confusing to the public. But do I think it's going to affect some people? Yes. I think some buyers are simply not going to be able to afford how they're going to have to wrap in the payment to realtors for the commission. It's not that buyers aren't paying for it now in some indirect way anyways. It's just the way it's structured right now. It's a little bit more streamlined in a way. And this is going to unstreamline it. But maybe, again, and I'm sure people will vehemently disagree with me, but maybe some necessary problems. What we don't want to happen is to have the public suffer.
Yeah, so it'll be something I think we're going to have to figure out as it happens, but it's definitely been a big shakeup. So it's interesting, but really appreciate this is all great perspective and loved being able to spend some time with you today. So thanks so much for joining us, Kelly.
Yeah, of course. You're welcome.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we're back, we'll be chatting with David Bergeron, whose company is changing the game in housing investments. Stay with us.
Calling all B2B sales executives. Ready to elevate your sales game? Meet Compose Comp, your partner in sales incentive excellence. Our tailored solutions blend expert design with tech innovation, ensuring your reps have the confidence to close deals. Take the first step to sales success. Visit composecomp.com and schedule your consultation now.
Our second guest today is David Bergeron. David is the co-founder and president of Reseed Partners, a firm that is shaking up the housing game by connecting investors to local operators to establish real estate portfolios. Welcome to Fuzzy Logic, David.
Thanks for having me on, Matt and Chris.
So first, we have to ask about your background and what led you to ultimately where you are now at Reseed Partners.
Background's pretty simple. I grew up in a suburb just south of Portland, Oregon, came down to Stanford for my college experience and actually played football there, which was great. Ended up on the East Coast, played a little football on the East Coast for a while before landing in Boston and meeting my first business partner, a guy named Roy Hirschland. We had a great run, built up a phenomenal firm called T3 Advisors that we ultimately sold to another larger firm called Savills, which then led me to launching the next company, which was Reseed. And Reseed Partners, sort of as you described, is on this mission to find and promote and enhance the power of local information when it comes to becoming a real estate investor and operator. And so we've built an entire verticalized platform that helps enable that in terms of finding successful assets that can be bought and connecting them with investors that really believe in the power of long-term ownership of real estate.
So this podcast is all about incentives and how they shape our society. You've now spent well over a decade in the real estate world. How have you seen the focus of developers change over the years? And what would you say are some of the most powerful incentives or disincentives that are driving behavior in building our housing supply today?
Real estate obviously is extremely old as an industry. It's been around forever. We've always needed places to live, and how they've looked and how they were architected and where they were located obviously continues to iterate from generation to generation. I think there's good developers and good investors that think about the asset of real estate. And it comes down to some primary fundamentals tied to location is huge. Finding a place and a spot that works really well and has a stickiness and longevity to it becomes a really important decision. Those incentives tied to what's around you and what's readily available is a huge reason why I think a lot of markets work versus others not working. And then finally, I think there's still this connection and relationship back and forth between buying and or renting real estate. I think there's so many elements that go into the incentives related to factors that the developers or a lot of the real estate professionals don't control. Interest rates, kind of macroeconomic trends. These are things that I think really impact buyers and or a desire for a buyer to either have the ability to buy or continue to rent. I think generationally, you've also seen the expectation, if you will, of owning and buying real estate continue to change.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, David, which kind of from my generational perspective, right? I bought my first house at 25 and that would have been like 2004-ish. At that point, it was considered taboo to rent, right? Like I've never rented in my entire life, which is a weird thing to say now. So to your point around how do people think about that, it's definitely changed. And so I think there's a much more fluid view around that now than there would have been in the past.
I think there's one other angle too that I hadn't considered until I purchased a house that was built in 1952, and that's we don't teach the same skills to like the next generation growing up. Where my own dad was an electrical engineer. Now he would tell you that he was not a great electrical engineer, and you don't want him wiring your house, but he could fix a light switch. He could like deal with things around the house if he needed to. I think there were very few people that I went to college with who were prepared to drywall and spackle. So when I look at buying a house, making that investment, and then being able to maintain or repair that thing that you purchased, there's a lot of people who simply do not have the skills today. And now the effort to now take that asset, take it, own it, make it better so that it can mature and you can exit at a higher price. Now it's a lot more work.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And you're seeing construction and labor and just in general, in a lot of ways, hard work is a little bit of a lost art. I'm with you. I think that they're extremely valuable. They're recession proof. They're practical when you have your own family and own your own home. And I think those are things that hopefully we can continue to bring back at some level because I think they're really, really important.
Yeah. So maybe to that point, because you guys both hit on this, which is, look, there's not necessarily a shortage of buildings, but it's a shortage of housing. So if we think about how do we close a housing gap with structures we might already have in places where people already live versus having to go further and further out or build in entirely new locations?
This is a question that people have been trying to answer for a long time, for decades. And depending on where you look up the information, there's anywhere between 3 to 5 million homes or residences that were short from a U.S. population perspective. And so that's a lot of places. We're missing a lot of inventory or housing stock, if you will, whether it's an apartment or a townhome or a single family home that we really need to find a way to activate. These things take decades to sort of implement and deploy and ultimately get into market and propped up to help people on the ground. So it's a real long game.
I'm curious from your perspective, do you think the ghost of 2008 still haunts us because of just how hard of a correction that was?
I think if history is any indication of how things go, we are pretty quick to forget and move on. But I think that works certainly to our benefit in certain aspects of our lives and our careers. We make a lot of the same mistakes over and over again, it seems. And my interpretation of that is there were a lot of people that were pinched and probably probably rightfully so, from some of the risks that were being taken. And I think that it'll happen again, right? Whether it's now or this kind of this current slide and recession that we're in some form or fashion experiencing today, or if it's going to be another 5 or 10 years out, we don't know. But again, I think that we are aggressive by nature. We are risk takers by nature. And I think that will continue to be the case as far as we're around and the economy has the incentive structures built as they are. This is partially why we started Reseed, was there's not a lot of people taking the long-term, hold forever, conservative type of approach to real estate investing. It's not a sort of a popular stance in traditional private equity. And I think the fact that it's not is one of the main reasons we like it, because it's contrarian in a lot of ways. And I think there's a lot of people that understand the components and the advantages of the tax and depreciation benefits of owning long-term real estate and just the power of compounding interest.
If you were to look into a crystal ball, what would you see as the future of housing in America? Do you think that millennials, Gen Z, should be optimistic about their opportunity for housing they can afford and the supply of homes available to them?
I think there is a lot to be optimistic about as it relates to that, primarily because real estate is actually a highly efficient market as a whole. It's extremely fragmented, right? So you take San Francisco for an example. The largest owners, the largest landlords in San Francisco, at least on the office side, for example, they own maybe 2 or 3% of the market, 5% of the market. Even if when you're the 800-pound gorilla as a landlord or an owner in a lot of these cities, you're still nothing compared to the overall market. And the same could be said for a lot of multifamily and housing. It's not like software where someone owns 80% of the market and they really dictate how the market works and how it's priced and who's let in and who's not. Because of that kind of democratization of real estate ownership, I think you really see at some level kind of capitalism at its finest. And markets work and ebb and flow based on supply and demand. And those supply and demand drivers can be very different in different parts of the country, but ultimately they need to square at the end of the day in a way that makes the market. So because of that, there'll be a lot of things that are impacting the profile of a millennial and how much they're making and how many kids they're having and how often they want to be moving to new cities. All those will be baked into the equation of how much you have to pay to buy your first home. And so I think the market will adjust and adapt accordingly. I think the housing stock will continue to be dynamic and flexible. I think we're seeing more and more of that. We're learning more and more about how to build highly and more energy efficient buildings and apartments and houses. We're learning how to make them more fire retardant so that you're not losing them because of disaster types of moments. So, again, the trend is certainly positive relative to being a homeowner long term. The concern and the reality, and we touched on this early, is we're not filling the pipeline of qualified, again, electrical engineers or plumbers or just trades folks that can really do this and build high quality product. Because I think that if we can build high quality with high quality types of parts, I think now you've got longevity and duration to the real estate too, versus being something that's going to fall down in 20 years. I think we want to build for the long haul. That will be determined over time based on, again, a lot of other incentives and factors that no one can really predict today. If I'm a betting man, I think that the ingenuity and survivability of this will end up falling in a good spot.
David, thank you so much for stopping by. I think we learned a lot about the incentives in the real estate development industry, and we really appreciate your perspectives. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll jump into our predictions for the future.
Hey B2B sales pros, want to maximize your team's performance? Discover Compose Comp, your key to optimize sales incentives. We blend expertise and technology to give your reps the edge they need to close deals. Don't settle for ordinary. Visit composecomp.com and unlock your team's full potential today.
Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic. Chris, we've talked a lot about the housing industry, where it's come from, the way that people are experiencing it today, and what some potential opportunities are for the future. What do you think about this? What are some of the incentives that we've uncovered about where housing is at today?
I think from both Kelly and David, we heard those who are buying and holding are doing it for different reasons than they would have historically done. So we're kind of in this weird, I don't want to say housing purgatory, but I think I'm going to coin that term, where people may want to move or may want to make different decisions, but they're incented not to because they're holding on to a financing and a funding model that doesn't exist anymore.
I also liked that Kelly talked about how there was an incentive to buy a house and flip it. And I think we saw some of that in the 2010s, called the HGTV generation. But the problem with looking at renovations on TikTok, on TV, is that they take something that takes 6 to 9 to 12 months and condense it into 30 minutes or 2 minutes. And what it covers or conceals is the amount of headaches that you go through to get that final result. And so we're almost incentivizing, we're positioning in the minds of a buyer this beautiful finished product, when the reality of the housing market in America is that you might have to actually do the work yourself.
I think you're right. The sort of, again, instant gratification with housing. But what I do think is interesting that more people are willing to stay longer in the places they're in and invest in it. Whereas when I got tired of a house, I just sold it and bought another one, right? Because it was easy. I wanted something bigger. I wanted something different. You can't really do that anymore. There's just not enough supplies. So you have to learn to love what you got, which is a problem from, I would take, a mobility perspective. Whereas America, taking a step back, America's the land of mobility forever, right? We would go anywhere. We would find gold and travel by wagons, right? Now people aren't willing to do that anymore. And that may have a long-term impact on the economy, and housing plays a big role in that.
It feels like the housing market as it works today is that sweater that's two sizes too small. Maybe it's the size too small, where there's too many people who need a place to live and not enough places that are financially available to them. And that the equations and the business model in real estate historically has been you build it, you sell it, you make money, and you walk away. And the problem with doing that is as costs go up, it puts more pressure on that resale point and on the size of the mortgages people need to take out, the people who are able to purchase those properties. So I really like what David's doing with Reseed Partners and saying, if we flip the model and say, I don't need to pull this massive profit within 12 months, we can amortize this over 30 years. We can take a lot of the economics that otherwise prevented people from having affordable housing and make it somewhat more of a reality, and doing it in local markets with local operators and not larger companies. I think that's a really awesome way for the housing market to develop in the future.
If I think about where government should get involved, would be with those types of initiatives, as opposed to we start picking winners and losers in government. Okay, you can build this new building, 8% of it has to be affordable housing. So what happens, right? You create in New York, the poor door, remember, and all that. Whereas I think if you have people who are locally embedded in the community, know the community, pull people from the community to help build, design, live, and thrive in that community, that government should be more flexible to those types of conditions, as opposed to what you saw when you lived in the Bay Area. It took 10 years and $1 million to build a bathroom, right? So I think you're going to start to see some of that has to unwind a little bit in order for housing to come back to historically what it would have been, call it pre-2008.
So let's talk predictions with our last minute left. What do you think is going to be the future of the housing market for the next 10 years in the US?
I think it's going to be a bit of disappointment. I think a lot of folks, you joke, right, millennial, I'm an Xer, right? I think I caught the tail end of what would have been the decent normal housing market with normal interest rates, by the way. I think you got the benefit of lower interest rates, but the prices went up. I think the next 10 years, the folks behind that are going to be experiencing not enough houses, not enough income to support it. And I think we're going to retreat back to a nation of renters, to be honest, which isn't necessarily, I'm not saying good or bad, but it does have an impact on why or how you should buy a house.
One of the trends we've had over all of the episodes of Fuzzy Logic, as we talk about incentives, it's always like the tale of two cities, the tale of two Americas, where there's going to be a segment of America that can't afford to buy houses, and they will continue to do so somewhat regardless of what the interest rates will be, because they can afford it and they will have better financial options available to them. At the same time, you will also see a group of people who give up on that journey and that vision as a whole, who are also told that there's a financial path to success, and that's not a more risky proposition. But the thing I think is challenging for renters is rent is mostly variable, and it can go up and it can go up dramatically. When you get a fixed rate mortgage, you have financial security in a way that you do not have as a renter. But I agree with you that we are going to be in a nation of housing purgatory in the future, but that it's going to be experienced dramatically different by different people.
Yeah, you're going to have a have and have nots, what you're trying to get at. The old adage was, if I had a degree, it gave me a little bit of a leg up because I made more money, et cetera. That may not be the case anymore. So now layer that in. So even if I have enough money and I've been able to work in a situation where I have a living to support it, there might not be anything there for me to buy. So all the more reason that we should figure out incentives to encourage people to own their own houses, because then they have an attachment to the community, as you mentioned.
Well, Chris, I would love to keep talking about this, but I actually have to get back to my own home renovation project. So with that, I think I will go pick up a hammer and I'll let you read us out.
Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Fuzzy Logic. Fuzzy Logic is produced by Mitch Rissmiller. Special thanks to our guests, Kelly and David, and to you, our listeners. New episodes drop Wednesdays wherever you get your podcasts. See you there.